Hey kids, Flexing Teacher Weber here. Hope you had a good long weekend. We're going to wrap up square roots this week. We're going to look at some more examples of using square roots. You've done a lot of questions with estimating of square roots. Now we're going to do something similar today, where you're using this idea of perfect squares to do some estimating with square roots, but it's going to be slightly different. So if you look at this first question, it says, identify all whole numbers with a square root between 8 and 9. Now, a lot of people look at this question and say, oh, easy. All the whole numbers that have a square root between 8 and 9 would be 8.1, 8.2, 8.3, but that's not quite it, and those aren't whole numbers, right? Those are decimals. We're looking for whole numbers that will have a square root between 8 and 9. So we're going to organize our thinking again using a number line. So I'm going to start off with a number line. Don't be afraid to make your number lines nice and large. You don't have to make them tiny. Make them nice and large so you can see everything you're doing, and so I can see everything you're doing. Now, just like before, we're going to put squares on top. And square roots on the bottom. But look at this time. Identify all whole numbers with a square root between 8 and 9. This time we are given square roots. We are given the square root 8 and the square root 9. So this time we're going to start with square roots. That's why it's important to label your number line and really read what you're given. So we're given the square root 8 and the square root 9. Now let's see what kind of information we can get from this. Let's sort of work backwards this time. If I'm starting with the square root 8, well, the square of 8 would be 8 times 8, which is 64. And if I'm starting with the square root 9, working backwards, the square of 9 would be 9 times 9, which is 81. So that means any number in this area that I'm outlining right now would have a square root that falls between 8 and 9. Now 64 has a square root of exactly 8, and 81 has a square root of exactly 9. So we wouldn't include those, but we would include any number between 64 and 81. Now the question specifies whole numbers. So that means all the whole numbers that fall between 64 and 81 will have a square root between 8 and 9. So the answer here would be any whole number from 65 to 80. We don't include 64 and 81 because they would have a square root that's exactly 8 and exactly 9. So it's sort of working backwards to get the answer here. Let's try another one. So same idea here. This says identify all the whole numbers. So again, we're not looking for decimals or fractions. All the whole numbers with a square root between 11 and 12. So let's start with our number line. And let's make sure we know what we're working with. So the top of our number line will be squares. And the bottom will be square roots. And let's look at what we have. Again, reading the question is really important. All whole numbers, so we're not looking for decimals or fractions, that have a square root between 11 and 12. So in this question, we are given the square root 11 and the square root 12. So let's label that on the number line. Square roots go on the bottom. 12. So we want all the whole numbers that will have a square root between 11 and 12. Well, let's work backwards to get the squares. The square of 11 will be 11 times 11, which is 121. And the square of 12 will be 12 times 12, which is 144. So that means any number that falls in this area between 121 and 144 will have a square root that falls between 11 and 12. And you can test it, right? Like if you were to test, let's say the square root of, say, 122, you would get a square root of 11.04536, which falls between 11 and 12. So the answer here again, if you're looking for all of the whole numbers that have a square root between 11 and 12, the answer would be any whole number, because we're only looking for whole numbers, from 122, because we wouldn't use 121 because that has a square root of exactly 11. Any whole number from 122 to 143. Okay, and you can test that. Pick a number from 122 to 143, find the square root of it, and that square root will fall between 11 and 12. Let's look at one last question. Use a number line to find a number that has a square root between 14 and 15. Well, once again, we're using a number line to find a number that has a square root between 14 and 15. And again, we're given the square root, not the square. So that's really important to remember. So start off with your number line. I know it seems repetitive, but the number line helps you organize your thinking. Put square on top and put the square root on the bottom. All right. Look at what you're given. You're given square root 14, square root 15. So let's label that on here. Put the smaller square root here, the larger one here. Let's work backwards now and find the squares. The square of 14 is 14 times 14, which is 196. The square of 15 is 15 times 15, 225. Now that means any number that falls in this area that the little highlighter's going through will have a square root between 14 and 15. And look at this time. The question says, use a number line to find a number that has a square root between 14 and 15. So there's actually unlimited number of answers here. You could have 196 and 1/10, because this time it doesn't even say a whole number, right? You could have 197. You could have 197.1 or 0.11 or 0.111. There's unlimited numbers that have a square root between 14 and 15. We could go on forever. You're asked to just pick one. I've given 3 of them. So that's how you use square roots to sort of answer some other problems. I'm going to give you a very small assignment on this today. And again, refer back to these videos because the videos are what I base the assignments on. Hope you have a good day. We'll talk again soon. Flexing Teacher Weber, out.